for that fantastic introduction. I was wondering if we could just get a quick idea of how much experience we have in the room. We have a few participants here, so if there's a poll Pallavi people could do, or maybe if they could just write in the chat how much experience they have with the course, so that I can kind of frame my presentation accordingly. And I think you're muted, Pallavi. Okay, cool. All right, wonderful. Thank you all. So we have some familiarity with the course, which is great. So the outline for today is that we are going to be looking, first of all, quite quickly at where we are with DP Theatre assessment with regards to the 5-year curriculum review process and the new course. And then we're going to go through each of the assessment tasks one by one, spending approximately 20 minutes on each assessment task. And just to let you know that at the end of each section, there's going to be a Q&A component. So if you do have any questions on, for example, the director's notebook, as I'm digging into it, you can either write them in the chat or just make a note of them. And then when we get to the end of each of those sections, there will be a space for you to ask any questions. So these GMT timings are approximately where we're going to be going. So just to give you an idea, I also appreciate that quite a few people will be engaging with this presentation after the fact. So for those of you who are joining us in the future, please feel free to use these timings to help you allocate the part of this video that you would most like to see. Okay, let's get on to it. So the 5-year curriculum review process and the new course. Essentially, what was decided with the planning team for the new course is that the existing course is excellent and we don't really need to make many changes to it. So that's good news if you're very experienced or quite experienced, as some of you are with the current course. It's not going to be changing that much. The new course was intended to be starting teaching this academic year, but because of the pandemic, it's been delayed slightly. So now teaching of the new DP Theatre course will begin in August 2022, so the next academic year. The cool thing about this delay is that lots of schools have been piloting the new DP Theatre course already and providing feedback to the IB. So as they're finding things out about the nuances of the assessment and the best way to put students through the experiences of the new course is being improved. So it's actually having perhaps a stronger curriculum review process because of the pandemic delay. A quick overview of the changes. Like I said, there aren't that many. Overall, the objective is to go for less writing because the current course is very heavy with the writing components. So the overall feedback, I believe, from teachers around the world is that they love the new practical focus on actual theatre work that's within this course. But right now, there's just so much writing. So that's going to be reduced, and that's going to be reduced through less requirements from the criteria, essentially. So the submissions, the actual writing components that will be uploaded have been reduced. The director's notebook is rebranded now as a production proposal, and it's going to be the new internal assessment. Very few changes to the research presentation, which keeps its name. The collaborative theatre piece is now rebranded slightly as a collaborative project, and it's now an external assessment. And when I say now, I mean, starting this current August for the new teaching. The solo theatre piece, few changes, it's still the HL component. All right, so the DN to the production proposal, some of the contextual research has been reduced, and there's no longer a requirement for analysis of team moments from productions. So those are things that have just been whipped out, and the length is now severely reduced. So from 20 pages and an almost unlimited word count, it's going to a maximum of 12 pages with 4,000 words maximum. Research presentation no longer requires a comparison to another theatre practice in Criterion D, but the students are going to have to make changes, connections between the chosen performance convention and the concept of theatre in the world, but almost exactly the same, the research presentation. The collaborative project is quite similar again, but it does no longer require the contextual research and analysis of the personal theatre context and that of a devising theatre company, or the process of the explanation of how the group was formed. So all of those heavy writing components from the first couple of criteria have been whipped out. And just like the DN, the length has been reduced. It's now 10 pages with not exceeding 4,000 words. And the cool thing now is that we get to send the whole production. So the whole production will be sent to the examiner, not just bits and pieces of it. Finally, the solo theatre piece, again, some of the heavy writing component has been reduced from the Criterion A. And to account for that, the length of the report will be 2,500 words. Okay, now we begin for real, discussing the director's notebook. So I've finished my quick review of how the assessment components are going to change. And I think you will have noticed that the vast majority of things are still going to apply as we move into new curricula. However, this current curriculum is going to be assessed up to May and November 2023. So we are staying in the current theatre curriculum for a while now. So it is important that we spend the majority of this presentation talking about the existing curriculum. So we're starting with the director's notebook. And the way that this is going to work is I'm going to start each section with top 3 tips, and then I'm going to move into each assessment component. So my main tip for the DN is to encourage students to dream big and think big. It's really important with this assessment task that students understand they are only limited by their imagination. Sometimes students get upset with the DN because they're coming up with a whole concept that they don't actually get to stage. But I think that that's the beauty of this assessment task, that you don't actually have to put it on. So you can do whatever you want. I always tell the students it must obey the laws of physics, and also, you know, you must produce something that's going to help achieve your desired impact and objectives. But aside from that, you can do whatever you want. So I do encourage students to dream big with this and imagine a fantastic concept. It's a lot of writing, it's a lot of work, and the more that students can get excited about the potential and kind of let their imaginations go wild, I think the more interesting and enjoyable the whole DN will be. Second tip is to have a very specific target audience. And this was something that was suggested to me from a DP design technology teacher, is you should be able to say 3 things about your target audience. So for example, the exemplar on the right was a student's envisioned production of Waiting for Godot by Beckett. And the target audience she identified were people who operate drones, people who suffer from PTSD, and people who are willing to undertake dramatic therapy. And these 3 components helped direct every aspect of her play. So I think the more specific you can get with your target audience, the easier it is for you to meet the requirements of the DN. And the final tip is to have students understand the difference between the original audience that the play was written for. Think of the premiere of the play, the original audience that the play was released upon, versus the contemporary audience that they've identified now. There will be some significant differences between the play that was originally performed and the audience it was performed for, and the new audience. And students need to understand what those differences are. Okay, so to get into the criteria, Criterion A, I would say that this is essentially a hardcore academic research paper. Think of an extended essay. where the research question is asking you to make a connection between the play's context and the play itself. Approximately 2.5 pages. Like almost all of the descriptors in the highest strand, highest part of the rubric, the command term explain is used. And at the back of the theatre guide, you'll see that explains is defined as a detailed account, including reasons or causes. And this is why students are really being pushed to write a significant amount, because a detailed account is a lot of writing. So essentially, I would suggest that students deal with the first 2.5 pages of the 20 they have for the director's notebook with like an academic research paper approach. This is going to look like an essay. Sections, body paragraphs for each context, clearly identify what is the context. Is it a theoretical context or is it a cultural context? And for students to be very specific about that, I think is useful. And obviously they need to have a range of sources. And I also advise that students use evidence from the play, as in quotations from the play itself, quotations from the dialogue, which evidences and supports why this context should be considered important for the play itself. And an exemplar of this is on the next slide. And this is from a student who did Ariel Dorfman's Death and the Maiden. And you'll see, it doesn't look particularly interesting unless you're an academic. But what is fantastic about this is the amount of referencing and research. And the students obviously decided to use footnotes here, but you can see from the extent of the research that the student has ensured that all of their points are underpinned with research from a variety of sources. So this is how I would suggest that students approach the first part of Criterion A. Second part of Criterion A, it's kind of tricky. The student is asked to look at the ideas of the play and how these are presented by the playwright. And I think the important thing to understand here is to think about, well, why is this different from a collection of literary themes that you would have on a SparkNotes webpage, for example? Why is how the ideas are presented by the playwright so important? And for this, I would suggest that you ask the student, why did the playwright choose a play, a piece of theater, as the vehicle for this idea? And how are the ideas in the play mobilized using the techniques of theater? So to think about this creatively, I would suggest students have mind maps, brainstorms, Venn diagrams, anything to show how the ideas of the play are connected and how they develop. And again, just like with A1, support points with quotations from the text itself. And then the exemplar, which you can see on this slide, what the student has done here is they've identified the theme of the neuroticism and modern warfare, and this is from Waiting for Godot exemplar again. And what the student has said is that each of these ideas are personified in a certain character. So this idea is personified in the character Rapunzel, and she's making a connection between characterization as a form of theater and an aspect of theater, and how that is super important in helping deliver this idea on stage. So the embodiment of an idea by an actor moving around the stage is an explicitly theatrical thing. So this is how the student is enabling a discussion of why a play is the perfect format or vehicle for this idea. All right, now we move on to Criterion B. So it's tricky in that students are asked to look at artistic responses, creative ideas, and explorations. And as a teacher, I always have a discussion with students about what does that actually mean? What's the difference between an artistic response, a creative, an idea, and an exploration? And then once we kind of identify what are these three things going to be, I would use that as a framework for structuring Criterion B. I think it's also really important after Criterion A, which is so text heavy, to have as many visuals in Criterion B as possible. So charts, images, graphic organizers, sketches. How can the student creatively respond to the text itself? And one of the ways of doing this, I would suggest, is to think about other aspects of their diploma. So think about theoretical concepts, for example, they're studying in language A, an idea discussed in TOK, or a specific CAS engagement, and use that as a lens through which to analyze the play. And I think this way you can become creative and more explorative with your response to the text itself. And here we see a student is doing Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and they have decided to explore the idea of evil. So they identify different types of evil and how it can manifest. And for each of those, this student has selected a different type of theater that she's previously studied, like theater of cruelty or theater of the oppressed. And then she is exploring how each of these aspects of evil could possibly be manifest using this different theater style. So this is a way that the student has managed to engage with the text in a more visual way, just to make it less word-y for the examiner. Okay, and B2, this is where the student has to analyze moments of team, tension, emotion, atmosphere, and meaning in plays that they've watched. Again, about 2.5 pages, I would say, and to do this separately from B1, I think what's important and what a lot of students miss is that you're not just analyzing a play that you've seen for nothing. You're analyzing a moment of a play that you've seen to see how the director uses a combination of performance and production elements in order to create something. And then, critically, what students are going to do is make a connection between what the director is doing in the play that they watched and what they could do as a director in their concept, which is growing. And also, I would think it's very important that students just focus on moments here. So don't try and analyze a whole play. The more short amount of time that students select in order to discuss, the more depth they're going to be able to go into in their analysis. And we see this in B2, and we also see it in Criterion D at the end of the director's notebook. The shorter the moment, the better, I would say, in most instances. I also like it when students explicitly identify what aspect of team. So for example, the emotion was of fear, panic, and anxiety, which is different to just saying the director created a moment of emotion. I would be very, very specific about what type of emotion it was, and that can act almost as a thesis statement for the section. So here in the exemplar, you will see that the student has chosen a moment from a production of A Doll's House, and the thesis statement is, during this moment, the director used a combination of movement, lighting, and sound to create a moment of hostile atmosphere. So the student is being very clear in the type of moment that was created and the performance and production elements that were used. Okay, and now we jump into their concept. So Criterion C, I would suggest that both strands of C are dealt with simultaneously. So C1 and C2, I would say that the best approach is that the student deals with both of those components across 5 pages. And the most useful approach, I think, is to begin with the target or intended audience and the clearly stated audience impact before moving on to a few directorial intentions. And I think the most important thing here is that you discuss with your students the difference between an intended impact, which is singular, and directorial intentions, which are plural. So yeah, first page, I would say, out of the 5, it's really important to identify those things. And you can see here in this exemplar, the student starts with the impact on the audience before moving into 3 intentions. And the student has color-coded the intentions and also numbered them, so 1, 2, and 3. And you'll see in an example that we look at later on, how that color coding can be really useful. Because then when the student is justifying a particular decision and tying it back to an intention, she can use that color for her text to help the examiner appreciate how she is not just making random decisions, but she's explicitly tying them back to intentions, which are themselves tied back to an impact on a target audience. So again, the second aspect of Criterion C is that we're looking at different performance and production elements. And across these 5 pages, I think there's essentially 2 ways you can do it. You could have like a costume section and a lighting section and have different sections which deal with performance and production elements. A drawback of that is that we do need to see how these work together. Another approach is that you structure your Criterion C according to the parts of the play. So Act 1 is going to look like this, Act 2 is going to look like this, which is cool because then you can see how the parts are working together, but it might be quite complex if you've got a lot of performance and production elements working. So how the student structures C is going to depend on their vision itself. And just a reminder that all of their things that they're doing must be explicitly tied back to impact or intentions, as you can see in this exemplar here. So she's actually labeled this section imaginative ideas, and then she's got the image of what she wants her stage to look like and how she wants it to work. And you'll see about 3/4 of the way down, there's text underlined, and this is where the student is explicitly connecting to intentions. So this is to show the examiner why I have chosen to do this and how it's going to help me achieve my overall impact on the audience. The final criteria, D, of the director's notebook, I would say, again, to deal with D1 and D2 simultaneously. So just like Criterion C, deal with both components of the assessment criteria at the same time. The division here should be that approximately 2.5 pages should be spent on each moment. So the students are going to talk about 2 moments separately. And again, I would say shorter moments are encouraged. Use color coding to explicitly connect choices back to intentions. Everything should be always explained with regards to how this helps achieve an intention and or an impact. And here you can see an example of a student's director's notebook where she's identifying the moment itself and the intention and how exactly she is going to help achieve this intention through the moment. There's also a diagram of some blocking, which is going to happen on the stage. Second part of D is wanting to talk about team again. So again, we are returning to B2 in a way. And I think the student can decide how they want to structure this. Again, it's tricky. One of, I think, the most effective ways is to move chronologically through the moment. So even though you have a moment that's only maybe taking 5 seconds, you could look at, what's happening in the first second, what's happening in the second second, and then each of those you're kind of split second or line at a time, looking at how the performance and production elements are working together. And that's how this student has arranged it. So she's got, for each line, you'll see the box at the top is what's happening during one line of text, movement, background, emotion, projection, and then another one, another moment. So she split the moment up into kind of component moments, and this is to really try and talk in as much depth as possible at what's happening on stage and how all of these things are happening at once. All right, now I have completed my section on the director's notebook, and I would just like to pause for a second and see if there are any questions in the chat. So if you would like to ask a question, you could actually just ask out loud, or you could write it in the chat. Full-length play. That's an excellent question, Sarah. I don't think it really matters, to be honest. I think that provided the student is passionate about the play, number one, and two, that they can find the research that's required in order for them to deal with Criterion A properly. I don't think it matters whether it's a full-length play or like a one-act. I think if it's a few pages, it might be challenging. because the student has to look at lots of different creative ideas and explorations. So that might really push their own creativity. But yeah, no, I don't think it really matters, provided the research is available. Thank you for that question, Sarah. All right, wonderful. So now we will move on to the research presentation. And this is a component which is not changing much in the new iteration of the course. So pretty much all of this will apply for years and years and years. My top 3 tips for the research presentation are: understand that the student must find ways to document their process. This is tricky because when students are really engaged in the process of putting this unfamiliar theater convention into their own body, when they're super engaged in that process, they're going to forget, as you would kind of want them to, right? They're going to forget, oh, I need to be recording my process. So force students to journal, force them to video themselves, force them to consistently and constantly reflect, because those key moments during the process are so important. So try and make sure that the student has a way of recording those. My second key tip, and I've actually started doing this recently, and it's been really kind of transformative in how I approach the DN, is provide students with the opportunity to teach their convention to other students. It's so important. And you will find that when they try and teach it to others, then they will be learning more about it themselves. So provide vehicles for that to happen, I think would be really cool. And it's kind of, like I say, it's changed how I've delivered the research presentation. The most important thing with regards to doing well in the research presentation is the timing of the presentation itself. It's heavy. The students only have 15 minutes, and you can think it like it's a 15-minute performance. That students need to be super prepared, and their timing needs to be on point, so that they don't spend too long on any of the sections. And they've really got to analyze how many marks are available for this, and that should dictate how much time they're going to spend on it. And I'm going to release my formula here for that, and I hope it's useful for you all. So I think that each of the sections of Criterion, with the exception of C, which is the performance of the moment itself, each of the sections should be approximately 2 minutes and 20 seconds. And this is going off a calculation that the performance itself will take a minute. So if Criterion C takes a minute, that will leave you with 2 minutes and 20 seconds for each of A1, A2, B1, B2, D1, and D2. So for A1, the student should clearly state, you know, my tradition is this and my performance convention is this, so that the examiner knows right from the beginning. And then I would say pick about 3 contexts in which you're going to talk about. And I think that the research should be displayed through quotes, paraphrased and summarized material. It's always nice when you see a student holding a book, you know, or making reference to specific direct quotes that they've got from an interview that they conducted with an expert. So I think finding ways to highlight the research itself is really important. So for example, a student will say, according to, you have to figure out how you're going to give citation, in-text citations during a presentation, which is fun. That can either happen on the slide or it can happen orally. I think that you need at least 5 sources that are specific to the tradition. And that can be quite difficult depending on the tradition itself. So students really need, I think in the first year of the course, to practice where you can find this research. And remember that A1 is not a focus on the convention whatsoever. A1 is about the whole tradition itself. I think the main issue that examiners cite is that students spend way too long on A1. So no longer than 2 minutes and 20 seconds is the challenge for that one. And I think that a picture can tell 1,000 words. So in this exemplar, you'll see the student has an image where she's talking about a fire that took over a Japanese city, and which in some ways led to the birth of bunraku. And I would strongly encourage students to use images throughout the presentation to help them, because they don't have much time whatsoever, and it is a race against time for RP. A2, you're specifically talking about the performance convention itself. And just like A1, I think it's great if they start by clearly stating it. My performance convention is this, and it uses, gesture, face, body movement, whatever. Again, be very, very specific about the research, where it came from, according to this person. If students can find differences between sources, I think that's really cool. So if they're doing commedia dell'arte, there's so much written about Pantalone, for example. If they can find, well, this source says this, however, this source says that, then they could make a connection to different perspectives on knowledge and maybe even TOK, and how do we trust the credibility or validity of a source. That's kind of really interesting. And it's a way to highlight the research process has been authentic to the examiner. And just remember that this one, unlike A1, is specifically focused on the convention itself. So here we have the student, as they are discussing the convention with the bunraku puppet, they're actually using the puppet as a prop to help them, which is useful. Okay, Criterion B, the tricky criteria with all theatre tasks is this: how do we show practical and physical exploration? I think that the best thing to do for this is to have the student identify different stages of their process. So they can think about Criterion B1 as starting from, I don't know anything, to, okay, now I kind of feel comfortable performing this convention. And then they could split that up into maybe 2 or 3 significant stages and talk about each of those stages. They need to be explorative, those stages. So I think one thing that the students can do is video themselves as they're exploring, and then they can have that video playing in the background on the slides while they're talking to the audience about the exploration itself. Use specific and detailed research. I think one of the issues could be that a student will forget about the research when they finish Criterion A. But B1 should be grounded in specific research that they've managed to find on how the convention is performed. So I would ask students to start each of their explorations with perhaps a quote that drove the exploration itself. And the other really important thing I think for B1 is have them demonstrate. So it's nice to have videos showing their process, but it's also really cool if they model it. So as theater teachers, we're used to telling students to get up on their feet, right? So I would tell them to get up on their feet and start acting it out and start modeling it, start embodying it as they're explaining it. It just makes the presentation more interesting. It'll actually help them to communicate their ideas quicker too, as it is a race against time. Okay, so here is an exemplar of a student doing just that. She's explaining it and she's doing it as she's explaining it. Then the difference between B1 and B2, students often find difficult to ascertain, but essentially B1 is about figuring out how to do the convention, and then B2 is about putting that convention in a moment of theater. One of the issues can be is that students spend way too long discussing the moment of theater they chose and why they chose it. I tell them like no longer than 20 seconds on that. Give a brief introduction to the play and the moment and the scene and where it comes from. And then the meat of B2 needs to be what decisions they made as an artist, as a performer, with regards to all of the knowledge they have from the convention from B1. How do you then decide how to put that into a moment? Explicitly talk about challenges, I think, is really important here. So difficulties that they had and then how they overcame them, and be as specific as possible. And I've got here, I decided it would be appropriate to turn my head 45 degrees because, and I've even asked students to look up the names for muscles. If they're having an issue with a muscle in their hand, for example, look up in biology and find out what that muscle is called, and then figure out what you're going to do with it. And the more specific I think students are with this, the more interesting it is for the examiner, and the better the student will be able to discuss their process. And also, this is a reminder to always return to research. So here the student is talking about the moment, but also talking about how she decided through referencing a text. Okay, Criterion C is the fun part, obviously. So this is where the student is going to be performing about a minute, right? This is interesting, this assessment, because it asks you to explicitly be confident. So I would say that the students need to commit 100% to the moment and lose themselves in it. And this is about, you know, the skill of the performer. And can you exist outside of yourself and perhaps your own insecurities around embodying something which is unfamiliar? So minimum 45 seconds, ideally approximately a minute. And also students need to be aware of the scene changes. There's quite a big transition to go into the moment and then to come out from it. And the research presentation is a performance. You've got the moment of theater, but then you have the 15-minute performance around it. So the scene changes in and out of the moment are really important. And the staging is critical. You are allowed to have text support, right? So you can't, the examiners don't want to see somebody else on the screen. However, you could have somebody cueing lights and sound for you in the background, and sometimes that can be useful. And here we have a student who did just that. There was a quick lighting change, which was used in the drama room, and this enabled the student to quickly move into the mood of the piece and then come out of it again. And you come out of it because you've got to deal with Criterion D, which is reflection. And I always like it when students are out of breath when they get to Criterion D. And hopefully they'll have enough time with which to deal with both components. So it's, again, 2 minutes and 20 seconds for the first part of D1. And this is, I think, really important when students pick 1 or 2 learning moments. And an interesting way to think about this is frame these learning moments using the language of the IB learner profile. So pick one of those IB learner profile aspects and then frame your learning moments with that language. How were you a risk taker, for example, and how did that help you learn? And then talk about the impact that it's had on you and be very specific about when that happened. You know, when I ran the workshop in the 2nd week, for example. And then you've also got to make connections between previous experience that you had as a performer. And I think this doesn't work when students are vague, you know, when they say, well, I played the role of Hamlet and. I think it's much more interesting when they say, I was struggling when I was doing Hamlet with this soliloquy at this moment, and I finally realized that, and then make a connection between that somehow and the learning moment in the research presentation. Okay, and the student has images from the play that she's talking about, which again can really, really help in making connections without using up too much time. Okay, finally, at the end of the research presentation, D2, and this is the one where students hopefully will have enough time to deal with it, but students routinely run out of time. And just a reminder that the examiner is told to stop the video at 15 minutes. So this is worth just as much marks as any other section of the criteria. So it's very important that students do give themselves at least 2 minutes to deal with this one at the end. It's tricky because the definition from the IB with regards to what another performance practice is very, very specific. So just please make sure that your students understand what that is. I'm not going to run through it right now, but it's all on the slides. And these slides will be available to you after the presentation, so you can go back and just pause it and see. It's also written in the theatre subject reports from the examiners too. I would reference research. So if the student's talking vaguely about Gestus, for example, and they're trying to make a connection to Brecht, I would say, go to Brecht, see what he says about Gestus, quote him, provide the reference to that quote, and then make the connection to your tradition, to your convention, sorry. So you're being very, very specific about the connections. All right, and that is the end of the research presentation. So I will just have a couple of seconds now if anybody would like to ask a question about the research presentation. Please do so now. You can either speak up or write it in the chat. Okie dokie, I think we appear to be good. So I hope that I have bombarded you with enough IB language that you just don't have any questions to ask about the research presentation. All right, cool. So now we're going to move on to the collaborative theatre piece, which is currently the internal assessment. And I believe it's one of the components which has been affected by the pandemic. However, students who are working on diploma theatre this year in DP1 will be doing the collaborative theatre piece. So I am going to talk about it now. And obviously students will be assessed on this component in the future. So the internal assessment, I think my top tips for this is, first of all, to understand which students find difficult to understand. And it's actually something that's been dealt with in the new iteration of this task, is that right now, almost 50% of the marks for the collaborative theatre piece come from stuff which happens kind of before the ensemble is even created. So a lot of Criterion A and Criterion B in the portfolio is about stuff that has really nothing to do with the final ensemble and play that the students create. So have students understand that the early stages before they've even got the group together are super, super important. And I think that also students will produce much stronger, better, more interesting theatre if the work that they do pre the formulation of the ensemble is strong and it follows the steps that are delineated in the guide. Secondly, much like the research presentation, students should document the process throughout. So you have to be creative about how you're going to do that. As a teacher and facilitator of this course, I'm basically just constantly reminding the students that they need to be recording rehearsals. They need to be reflecting, and they need to find creative ways to record process, because process is what the portfolio finally is all about. So if students have not recorded that process, it's very difficult for them to do well in the portfolio. And finally, I think, this is one of the most challenging theatre tasks in terms of students' interaction with other students. They're finally given the opportunity to create their own piece of theatre and what they want to send out to the world, but they have to work collaboratively with other students in doing that. And it's going to fall apart, right? So this, if you've ever worked in a creative ensemble yourself, and I'm sure all the theatre teachers have, this naturally falls apart and comes back together again. So I would say that when it does fall apart, in those times of crisis or trial or disagreement, students should then return to the theatre companies. Return to the theatre companies that they chose at the beginning to research, and return to the approaches of those theatre companies. The companies themselves that they've chosen and their stimulus are all they have to hold on to, their starting point. So ensure that students are comfortable with the starting point, the stimulus they have, and that they're comfortable with the theatre companies that they've chosen to research, because they're going to need to return to those in times of trial. All right. Criterion A. So this is, students are asked at the beginning, and I think it's a part of the process which people can often kind of forget to do. Students are asked to do a personal theatre audit, where they understand and appreciate and reflect upon who are they as theatre makers. And I think it's really cool to have students actually do this authentically at the very beginning of the process. If you think about the research presentation, the solo theatre piece, the director's notebook, context is always about somebody else. Here, context is mostly about the students themselves. And I think it's really important that students ask themselves, what are my approaches? What are my interests? What are my skills in theatre? And have students authentically undergo that. You can make connections here to other aspects of their life, other aspects of their diploma. This section is really cool for making connections to TOK and CAS, how the student's interest in theatre is linked to them as a global citizen, issues, things that the students care about, that they feel passionate about. This is all grist for their mill in Criterion A1. And here we have a student who has divided, this is an exemplar from her portfolio at the beginning. She's divided her approaches, skills, and interests into kind of two themes. One theme is politics and history, and another theme is gender equality. And what she does for each of these themes is she looks at the interest, skill, and approach for each of them. So here you can have politics and history, and you'll see she's going to have an interest in political theatre and talk about that. So that is a way to organize the personal theatre audit, which ends up becoming A1. A2 is the other context, which is the theatre company that the student chooses to research. I think it's important that it's appropriate because the word is used in the criterion. So it does need to be a theatre company that devises and stages original pieces of theatre, and that can be quite tricky. So I think it's important that students understand what that means. And also that there's enough research available, because there are some fantastic theatre companies out there that do original pieces of theatre, but the students won't be able to find enough research. So understand that students do need to be able to find research, and obviously the student needs to be passionate about it. I think the trick to organizing A2 is that the student should be able to divide it into a few creative processes. A few different approaches that the company uses. And I would say ideally 2 or 3. So approach 1, approach 2, approach 3 of the company. And that's kind of the structure of the section. And also I think that another trick is that the student should be able to make very, very specific connections to productions that the company has staged and how the approach has led to a certain manifestation in a certain play. So you can see here in the exemplar, the student is talking about the theatre company, and what she's done is that she has identified that there are a couple of different approaches. One is drawing ideas from previous performances. Another one is flexibility, experimentation, and the lack of process. And she's got each of those, and for each of them, she is making connections to actual productions that the company has put on and how that approach led to that piece of theatre. Okie dokie, Criterion B, again, we still have not formed the company. So in B1, the student needs to talk about the process of forming the company. This is tricky. And I think usually theatre classes, or sometimes theatre classes, only have a few students. So the company that they're going to form is almost decided for them. So it's very, very tricky. And that might be one of the reasons why the IB is removing this component in the newest manifestation of the collaborative theatre piece. However, students currently need to deal with it. I would say that students need to go through a process where they share the audit that they've done, their skills, interests, and approaches, share those with the other students, and then have a discussion about the type of theatre that they would want to create and how the type of theatre that they would want to create would be affected or developed with regards to the other people in the room. So there's many ways that you can do this. In this particular exemplar, what the student did is she kind of put a profile for each of, there were 5 students in this class. She put a profile for each of the students, what they were interested in, and then she looked at kind of some alchemy of, well, what happens if we put me with student 1? What happens if we put me with student 3? And then what would be the benefits and the drawbacks to those skill sets being matched? And then she later would develop this in terms of the types of theater that they were interested in. So that's an approach, but just I would say that make sure that the formulation of the group is actually something which is explicitly dealt with during the process, and that students document that so that they have something to write about in this part of the portfolio. Because I think B1 is probably the one part of the portfolio that students end up thinking, what do I write here? And the more that you actually authentically go through that process, obviously the more they'll have to say about it. B2 is the starting point. So how they chose and explored it. Exploration of the starting point is fun. I would really encourage students to explore it practically and physically as well as theoretically. And if you've already done the research presentation, then you can discuss with the students how they practically and physically explored a convention in the research presentation. And maybe they could think about how they could apply some of those techniques of practical and physical exploration to the starting point itself. Because I think a lot of times students just want to talk about the starting point that they've chosen and theoretically what it could mean, whereas actually getting them up on their feet and then documenting that explorative process is probably going to be more interesting and meaningful for the development of the piece. So another thing to identify is obviously, according to this criteria, the exploration doesn't end up in a vacuum. The exploration ends up with a specific intention. So I think the neat thing to do is have students talk about how the exploration occurred, how it came from the starting point, and then how it arrived at a specific intention which they've chosen for the performance. And you can see that here. In this exemplar, the student had 3 different explorations, and each of the explorations arrived at a different intention. And then from that, she actually devised an intended audience impact along with her group. So the intention that was the result of this particular exploration that you can see was that they wanted to instill discomfort within the audience by manifesting the severity and brutality of the abuse facing women. And this was the 3rd intention. And you can see how, if you were to read it, how the exploration of the starting point resulted in that particular intention. Okay, and obviously they arrive at an intended audience impact, which is also connected to an intended audience and the intentions themselves. So ideally, all of these different pieces will connect to each other, just like they would in the director's notebook. When I deliver the course, I tend to leave the collaborative theater piece to last because I like to make connections back to the director's notebook and the research presentation, as I've been doing during this talk. And it's really helpful when students are deciding on their intentions if they've already done it theoretically in the DN. Okay, so for the 3rd criterion for C, I would suggest, just like in the director's notebook, I would suggest that the best way to deal with Criterion C is to ensure that you deal with Criterion C1 and C2 simultaneously. And this is because you're telling a story. C is about telling the story of how, okay, we've got our intentions, we've got our audience, we've got our intended audience impact. How do we get from that to the performance itself? So telling that story is going to take you approximately 4 pages. And in that story, they need to specifically identify their own contributions. And students find this really difficult because it's a collaborative process and they're all working together. So how do I pick apart what I actually did? And one thing that I would often advise students to do here is color code. So they can say right at the beginning of Criterion C that I will use this color or this underlining or whatever to identify what my contributions were. So as they're telling the story, the examiner can see very clearly what parts of this portfolio the student is requesting to be assessed against Criterion C1. So in this exemplar here, you can see that the student has identified their specific contributions using text which is bold and in orange. So the student is telling the story of what they call stage 2 in the play. And during the storytelling of Criterion C, they have explicitly identified what they did as a member of the ensemble. All right, and then C2, again, you're going to deal with all of C together. I think what C2 does is it provides students with the superstructure for Criterion C, because it asks that students deal with how the piece was developed, structured, and prepared. And I would have these as separate chronological sections. I think is the easiest way to go. Obviously, the definition of these terms can be kind of debated. But for me, the easiest thing to do is say you start with a development, then you move to structuring, and then finally you prepare for performance. So I would say that that's the superstructure of Criterion C. So across those 4 pages approximately, you're going to have a development moving into a structure, moving into a preparation section. And in that storytelling, they're going to have specific things that they did, which is C1. And C2, I think, is really important that you address this by constantly connecting back to your intentions, just like you would with the director's notebook. So why did you make that decision collaboratively? And then how did that decision help you achieve what you wanted to do for the piece? Here in this exemplar, we can see that the student has used development, structure, and preparation in order to show how they're going to achieve intentions. Okay, finally, with Criterion D of the collaborative theatre portfolio, D1 is where the students are connecting to the video that they're submitting. So I think what's really important here is that you deal with D separately. So D1 should be quite distinct from D2. D1 is approximately 2 pages and approximately 1 page for each moment if they've picked 2 moments in the video. And I think that it's really important that students identify their choices according to the specialist theatre roles. So this structural nature of the course, where students' engagement is either as a performer, a deviser, a director, and or a designer, and the CTP students are performing all of these roles or a selection of them at any one moment. So I think it's really cool if when students are talking about the video that the examiner is watching, they can say, you know, here I worked as a performer, or here my work as a director is seen, or here I designed the lights. So use that in order to discuss the piece, and then be very, very specific. So the student can say, you know, as shown 37 seconds into the clip of moment 1, you will see that I chose to do this as a performer, for example. And then to justify again back to the intentions. So we're always tying our decisions back to what we've chosen to do for the piece. And in this exemplar, you can see that the student is doing just that. They've actually discussed my role as a performer and my role as a lighting designer. And in each of those, they're connecting back to the intentions, and they're being specific with regards to sections of the video which the examiner is watching. And this will really help the examiners award marks to the students, because the students are being very, very specific about what they are talking about with regards to the criteria. Finally, the end of the collaborative theatre piece asks students to evaluate the whole piece. And this evaluation is quite tricky, because the students need to do 2 things. They need to provide an explanation of how the intentions were fulfilled, as well as the extent to which the intended impact was achieved, which is essentially asking for, you know, qualitative and quantitative mixed methods data analysis. So it's quite advanced what we're asking the students to do in D2. I would say that students should deal with specifically how the intentions were fulfilled, and then move on to the extent to which the impact was achieved. And make sure that when students actually perform this, they have a feedback session which is recorded so that students can make specific and detailed reference to quotations from audience members. I've also had in the past students having a form or a survey that they can have the audience members complete, and then they can provide some kind of quantitative data analysis on those survey responses. And that really, really helps with looking at the extent to which something was achieved. And in this exemplar, you can see just that. So the student has the survey that was given to the audience, how the questions in the survey link to the intentions that they've identified, and then they ask the audience to rate them on a specific scale to see the extent to which anything was met. So this is very, very specific and detailed. And what I like about this is that the student can also make connections to specific things that the audience said. Okay, and now we have got to the end of the section on the collaborative theatre piece. So I would just like to take a few seconds to look at the chat, and if anybody would like to ask any questions on the CTP, you can go ahead now.
Antony, there was one question on the research presentation that came up slightly earlier on. The question is, can you provide official feedback at different stages of the course for one task? For example, if the RP is going on, it's a long duration. So can I provide feedback on A1 and A2, say in November, and then B1 and B2 in say February or March, because the student is working on it over a period of time? Is that okay?
Yes, totally. That's an excellent question. Thank you very much, Pallavi. So what the theatre guide states is that the teacher is required to give feedback once on a complete version of the presentation, which you would usually do, towards the end of the process. However, what's really cool is that you can give formative feedback as the presentation is going on different components. So what I would do is have students discuss or present with their peers various bits and pieces. And then what I would really push for is having the students provide the formative feedback to each other as well, so that their understanding is growing. And I'd always ask the students to make specific reference to the criteria when they're providing the formative feedback to each other. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you, Pallavi.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's one last one, which is particularly to do with the fact that, schools are now remote and theaters around the world are shut. So obviously getting students that experience of live theater is very difficult. And considering that many of the students are probably now watching pre-recorded productions or productions that are available online as recordings, how is it that, is it okay for students to quote these film productions in their director's notebooks, or should it only be live productions? How do they work around that?
Wonderful, thank you. Another excellent question. Yeah, I think that the IB is well aware that during the pandemic, but also before, students are in different contexts. And this is, I think, part of the IB, making sure that they're an inclusive educational system. We do have some students who are working in contexts where they might have no access to any live theatre whatsoever. And the student should not be penalized for that. For example, if you have a student in London or New York, they have access to a tremendous amount of live theatre, and they should not be benefited by that. So what the IB says is that recordings of live theatre performances online are totally fine. With regards to the analysis. So there's Digital Theatre Plus, which is a big platform where you can get access to recordings online. There's various other things. You even find some stuff on YouTube now. Students are usually better than me at finding stuff online, but there is plenty of live theatre online, so that is totally acceptable. For example, in the director's notebook where the student is analyzing moments of live theatre, they can make reference to stuff that they've watched online, provided it was a live performance. So it can't be, Kenneth Branagh's film of Hamlet. It would need to
Okay.
be Kenneth Branagh acting in Hamlet, which was a live piece of theater that was filmed.
Right. So no film adaptations in that sense, right?
No.
Okay, perfect. That clarifies that. Thanks so much, Antony.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions that we've got there. So now we're going to move into the final part of this presentation, where I am going to discuss the solo theater piece. And my top 3 tips for the solo theater piece, this is obviously the higher level component. The choice of theorist, theory, and aspect is super important here. I would say that there's 3 criteria that they need to meet. It does need to be considered a theorist. There does need to be research available, and it should be something that genuinely inspires and excites the student. Also, the aspect that they choose does need to be something that can be shown on video. So if they choose something which is about the internal psychological workings of the actor, there's no way that the examiner could identify how well the student is doing that on film. And the final part is ensure that how the student puts the piece together is tied to the aspect itself. So whether they decide to devise their own piece, or whether they decide to adapt maybe a poem, or whether they decide to use an existing piece of drama, that decision-making process should be aligned to the aspect that they've chosen. Okay, Criterion A1 and A2, students are going to deal with these together. This is, again, more like hardcore extended essay academic research paper, as we saw with the beginning of the director's notebook. And I would just say here that the important thing is that students are contextualizing the theorist and the aspect. They're not necessarily contextualizing the theory itself. And in some cases, that can be quite a specific demarcation. Also, I think that it's really important that students split this up into certain contexts, just like you would with the beginning of the DN, for example. So context 1, context 2, context 3, for example, and then how this is shaped, either the theorist or the aspect or both. You can have a context that's shaped both the theorist and the aspect. And again, we need a range of appropriate sources, just like with other assessment tasks. And what that means here is that you do need to have things that the theorists themselves have said, but also it's really cool to have that secondary research, things that other people have said about the theorist. And here is an exemplar of a student who did Cantor's Theatre of Death, and you will see that she has specific detailed research here using footnotes, and it's divided into context. So she has one context here, which is called the dialectic, and this is a specific context which is contextualizing both Cantor and the aspect of Theatre of Death. Okay, Criterion B, exploration, with carefully selected appropriate and practical techniques. Exploration, again, is something that students will be used to. Specifically, this is probably best connected to the exploration of the convention in the research presentation. I think usually students will have a separate section for B1 and B2. So B is going to be approximately 1,000 words. So you're looking at approximately 500 words for each. And this first part of B, students need to have a range of explorations. I would say maybe 3 different types of explorations to show a range. And then I would start with some research about that exploration and then have the student, usually I think images are really cool here, but have the student practically explaining what they did and how it led to the development of the intentions is super important. And you can connect this back to the collaborative theater piece with this idea of an exploration leading to an intention. So in the collaborative theater piece, the exploration of the starting point leads to the development of the intention. Same thing here. You explore, but you're not exploring a starting point. Now you're exploring an aspect of theory, but the same thing. It's going to lead to an intention. So here in the exemplar, we can see that the student is exploring the etudes as an aspect of theory, and she will arrive from this exploration to the intentions themselves. And it's nice always, I think, to have images here to show how that these were practical and how they were conducted. B2, I think it's better, as I said previously, to have this separate from B1. However, it might be that for whatever reason, a student can better address Criterion B by having B1 and B2 happening simultaneously. But usually, the students that I've worked with, it works better to split them up, and that the second part of their Criterion B, so the second 500 words, for example, is addressing this strand. And this is talking about feedback that they've received during the process and then reflecting on that feedback to show how the piece was developed, which is tricky because it's not just talking about feedback. It's asking the students essentially to be reflexive and take action from the feedback which has been received. So usually, because B1 is dealing with the development of the intentions, I would have students do that first. And then B2 is, okay, I'm working with this stuff, and now I'm receiving feedback, and that's helping me develop the piece itself. So again, have students document the process and specifically record. I always have students take out their phones and record voice notes after they've done something, and then their peer mentors will give them feedback, and then they can quote their peer mentors in their report and say, for example, if I move on to the next slide, this is a student receiving feedback, and she's actually quoting what her peers felt about the piece. And then she reflects upon that. So my peers said this, I felt this about what they said. She connects back to the aspect of theory, and then she looks at how that's developing the piece itself. Okay, Criterion C is obviously the performance. So this is not written, this is the video. And just a reminder again, that ensure the aspects that the student chooses can be clearly seen in the video. So because Criterion C1 and C2 are asking that the examiner can see them, number one. And then the second part is that the student really needs to understand that performance and production elements are a huge part of the video. So how did the student decide to stage it is very, very important. The solo theater piece is asking for the student to be a director, a deviser, a designer, and a performer. So how did they decide to stage it? Now, obviously, this is going to depend on the aspect of theory they've chosen. So some theorists and some aspects of theories don't really have much to say about lighting, for example, or would even explicitly require standard basic white lighting, as might be the case with Bracht. So have what the theorist says and what the aspect of their theory says, have that direct everything. And if it says that not much of a particular production element should be used, then that's important. And if it says that a specific amount of effort needs to go into a specific production element, then that's important. So all of that research that the student is including at the beginning of the report, that needs to be manifest on the video itself, so that we can see that the student has addressed the aspect of theory, not just in what they're doing as a performer, but also the production elements themselves. And I would say that, with the pandemic, obviously we have a lot of students performing online, and examiners are aware of that. And I think examiners understand and appreciate that students can be creative in how they interpret the application of certain aspects of theory to the online environment. So provided the student is doing their best to make a connection between what the theorist is saying and how they're going to perform it, it's totally cool if the student has some creative license here, especially online. So here we can see a student is performing, and this is based upon Robert Wilson's theory, and it was focusing on movement and lighting and the interaction of these two things. So you'll see that, there's not much happening in terms of set. There's not much happening in terms of costume, but there's quite a lot happening in the other production elements, and that's specifically driven by the aspect itself. Okay, and finally to Criterion D, which is the final part of the report, part 3 of the report. It's 1,000 words, and I think it's probably the best way to divide Criterion D into 2 sections, D1 and D2. I think it's best if students deal with them separately, so 500 words for each, approximately. Interestingly, D1 of the solo theatre piece report is very similar to D2 of the collaborative theatre piece portfolio, because they're both asking for the student to assess the piece and look at impact and intentions and the extent to which they were met and things, but there are subtle differences between them. So a cool activity that I've done with the students in the past is to show them those 2 different criteria and have them kind of spot the difference and discuss why have the examiners decided that they're looking for this specifically in this one, but this slightly different nuanced version in this other one. And that discussion can really help students understand what examiners are looking for in D1 of the solo theatre piece report. So here we're looking at the extent to which intentions were met and the impact on the audience. Those could be separate. You could have like 250 words on the extent to which the intentions were met, and then 250 words on the impact it had on the audience, or they can be, woven into each other. Whichever way, it's super important that the students are, just like with the CTP, referencing specific feedback which they received. And it's a requirement also with this task that there's a talk back after the performance. So those talkbacks should be recorded. One of the cool things I think about students who have to perform online in a pandemic distanced learning environment is that the online format actually provides really cool means of recording feedback. So you can send, Google Forms, or you can just record the Zoom meeting or whatever. Students can be very creative with how they conduct talkbacks online. And I think there's lots of interesting data that can be got from that, which doesn't really happen so well, perhaps, with an actual performance. A lot of times with the actual performance afterwards, the student's exhausted and there's a lot of adrenaline that's been released in the performance, and afterwards the audience are kind of wrapped up in it, and you can't necessarily understand or hear what they're saying, even if the student is running around with a microphone or whatever. So I think it's really cool that this is a particular type of the assessment which lends itself quite well to the online environment. But regardless of how it happens, just ensure that the students are asking specific, detailed questions to the audience. So not just, what did you think of it? But it's nice if the language of their intentions frames the language of the questions that they're asking to the audience members. And then they can get direct quotations from the audience, which they can use in their framing of the report. Here in the exemplar, you can see that the student is making specific reference to parts of the video, which is something that I also suggested could be done in the collaborative theatre piece video, and the student has done it here. So they've said to the examiner, you can see this at 1 minute 55 to 2 minutes and 3 seconds in the recording, and then she's making a connection between what's happening on stage in the video that the examiner is watching and the feedback that she received from the audience members. So then she moves into quoting the audience members and then is connecting that to the intention. You'll notice that this whole paragraph is an analysis of the extent to which I1, which is intention 1, was met. And she says, it was met to an effective extent. And then the paragraph itself talks about how this intention was met to the effective extent, making specific and detailed references both to the video and to the feedback that was received from the audience members. And finally, and this is just like the research presentation, I think it's tricky for students to have enough time and or words to get to D2. So it's very important that students have approximately 500 words at the end of the report so that they can competently deal with D2, because the marks are there to be got. And for this one, students are asked to talk about what they've learned. And I would say 3 takeaways. And just like I suggested earlier on, if they can make links to the IB Learner profile, that's really cool. So if students have about 3 takeaways of what they've learned, link those to the IB Learner profile. And the tricky part here is the implications this has for their work in the theatre. So for each learning takeaway, students, I think, should deal with what are the implications. And we do understand that not every student is going to move on and study theatre in the future, right? So this could be a more speculative reflection. It could be looking forward maybe to applying the implications to within theatre in a broader context, but to try and make a connection between where they're going in their life and what theatrical type things they're going to be doing in the future and how this is going to help develop them. Okay, and I've left just 1 minute to discuss any questions. So if anybody has, here's the exemplar of that one. I'll just leave it on the video for a second if you're watching the recording. So finally, Q&A on the STP if anybody has any questions. Okay, that's perfect because we've run out of time. So thank you all for listening, and I wish you all the best of luck with your theatre explorations.
Antony, thank you. This was so comprehensive. I think the IB should just replace all guidance on the PRC with this video now. This was, I'm sure everybody who came in found this extremely useful. I know I did. Lots of very pointed advice with great examples of student work. And to those of you who are keen to know a little bit more about how you can go about conducting your theatre course, especially now in a hybrid or a virtual setting, we are doing a Q&A with Antony as well as some other portfolio exhibition educators slightly later today. This is going to be at 11:30 a.m. GMT. So it's going to be in an hour from now. You can learn more about planning hybrid exhibitions for portfolio subjects. If you'd like to come in and attend that session, you can either register through the IBDP Thinkathon website, or there's a link in the chat, which our support team is adding just now. You can directly log in right from there as well. Once again, a final reminder, if you're interested to know more about how you can use Toddle at your school, we're doing a quick walkthrough again in about 15 minutes from now. That's 10:45 GMT. Do drop into that session using the link in the chat. We'd love to share with you what we've built for DP, and you can take all of those fun and exciting learnings back to your classroom as well. Finally, Antony, thank you once again for being such a wonderful, patient host and for sharing all of these great insights with us. We'll see you in an hour at the Q&A, and we'll see all the rest of you there as well. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thank you.